Okay, everybody, we're looking at agricultural development, and these are the points we're going to hit upon, and they are a little overlapping with the reading that I had you do last week, but also some new material and material that augments it as well. So we're looking at agricultural hearths, agricultural revolutions, the first, second, third, and also the Green Revolution. Okay, so when we think about agricultural hearths, we're talking about places where agriculture first developed independently in different parts of the world, and you can see that they're numbered here. So you should have some familiarity where these places are. So Central America, early civilizations, they give you some examples here of what kinds of crops they developed in these hearths. So in Central America, we had these root vegetables like sweet potatoes and things that we still associate with Central America, like chiles and peppers. In the Andean highlands, we have tomatoes being developed along with other vegetables like beans and potatoes. West Africa, coffee, things like palm oil, yams. In East Africa, also we have coffee. We also have olives, which is associated perhaps not so much with Africa anymore, but still can be grown there. Cottonseed oil. In the Fertile Crescent, which I'm sure you've heard about, we have between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, peas, things like wheat. The Indus River Valley, we have barley and cotton. North Central China, we start to get some fruits that we associate with things that we have every day here on the other side of the world. And in Southeast Asia, we have things like coconuts and tropical things like sugarcane and bananas. So, one thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about the spread of these things, right, we're talking about something called diffusion, and we're going to get more into that in some of our other units. But this is relocation diffusion, whereby people actually moved around from these hearths and spread them around the world physically, right, taking seeds and in some cases the actual fruit or vegetable. And so they've been relocated and they've been diffused around the world from there through relocation diffusion. All right, we're looking at the Agricultural Revolution trilogy. So when you think of trilogy, maybe you think of Raiders of the Lost Ark or Star Wars or Fast and the Furious, none of which ended up being trilogies in the end of the day. But anyway, moving on. So we're thinking about the first agricultural revolution. That one is also called the Neolithic Revolution. Neolithic, and this should have been in your textbook. And this started 11,000 to 14,000 years ago. So we're talking pretty long time ago that we started to see the first beginnings of organized agriculture and people staying in one spot to do so. The second agricultural revolution, we're starting about 250 years ago. And that's when we started to get more advanced farming techniques, where we have a shift from subsistence only to a blend of subsistence and commercial agriculture. And that's due to the advent of mechanized vehicles and innovation tools, things being invented to help people with those farming endeavors. We have the third agricultural revolution starting about 100 years ago. And this is where we still have a blend of subsistence and commercial, but more of an emphasis on commercial farming. And this is because of scientific advancement and the internationalization of everything, globalization. And when we look at this, we're thinking from a very small scale of agriculture, right, where we had subsistence farming for centuries. And then in the last, 250 years, that got broader and broader and broader to now when we're talking about an agricultural system, we're really looking at something that's gone from a very local scale to a global scale. All right, the first agricultural revolution, I'm abbreviating it FAR here just for the ease of it. So for thousands of years, humans fished, hunted, and gathered, and they had to move around to do that. And starting at about 10,000 BC or BCE, The first agricultural revolution, brought organization and the ability for human beings to stay in place. So, how'd they do this? Well, they started to develop vegetative farming, taking the shoots and stems and roots of wild plants and planting them in one place purposely. They also got into seed agriculture using grains and fruit plants. And they got into using animals as well in their farming. So, domestication of animals, the selection of the best plants, the selection of the best plants and ways to grow them. So, they figured out which was the easiest to grow. And that led to more productive and tastier foods. And then the animal husbandry comes in with domesticated animals. And they were bred for productivity to help them farm. And also, when it comes to eating the animals, bred for taste. And remember, I want you to recall that I just showed you all those different places where agriculture developed independently. This was not a uniform process that took place all at once, everyone doing the same thing. It happened at different paces in different places around the world, and that varied wildly by climate and tradition and so forth. All right, we're looking at the SAR, or Second Agricultural Revolution. So, about 250 years ago, we start to get some real advanced mechanization that helped people be a lot more efficient in their farming and turn the corner to going something beyond subsistence farming. So, things like the reaper and the cotton gin. So, I just want you to have an understanding of what these are. So, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin would make a great band name, but is not. 1793, and I'm going to show you this short video on it right here.
They've been making cloth out of cotton in India for several thousand years now. But the kind of cotton that grew in this country, except right along the Atlantic coast, was short staple cotton. With short staple cotton, the seeds were embedded and were sticky, and pulling the seeds out of the cotton was very, very difficult. I mean, for instance, one man could pick about 50 pounds of cotton in the field. It would then take him 3 weeks to pull the seeds out of the cotton. And Eli Whitney, who was a New Englander from Connecticut, visited the South. And so he was one of these Yankee tinkerers, and he came up with this device that is so simple any competent carpenter can make one in half a day, which had combs that would pull the cotton, and then they would go through other combs, leaving the seeds behind. And the seeds would go into one box, and the cotton would go into another. And with the cotton gin, one man could gin as much cotton in one day as previously had taken him 3 weeks. In other words, an enormous saving in labor, and thus a tremendous drop in the price of cotton to produce. So you could sell it for less and still make a handsome profit. And it turned out that the American South was the best place in the world to grow cotton once the cotton gin was invented. The growth in the cotton industry was just phenomenal in the antebellum period. I mean, we went from like 40,000 pounds in 1800 to 2 billion pounds in 1860. And it became known as King Cotton. Slavery had been in decline. A lot of the plantation owners at the end of the 18th century were either freeing their slaves.
Okay, so he starts to get into other things related to history that we're not exploring in this course. But you can see that this really coincided with early American history as well. So these advances helped the United States become outsized in its importance early on for such a young country, because it coincided with a lot of the inventions that were happening around the world, including some important ones that were happening in the United States, like the cotton gin. And then in the mid 1800s, we have the McCormick Reaper, once again allowing farmers to do things a lot more quickly.
Here, folks, piece of American history. Going to begin process here. About 170 years old. 1840, not 1940. 1840. No. I'm not trying. Yeah. 170 years old.
So you see, that's still horse drawn, and when we saw the cotton gin, that was still hand drawn. So we're not talking about really sophisticated like uh, gasoline powered machines yet, but we are talking about things that did make a real difference to agriculture in terms of efficiency.
They've been making cloth out of cotton in India for several thousand.
Continuing with the SAR, we have the advancements in tools and the approaches to agriculture, and that is leading very quickly to a surplus of food, more food than people had ever had available before, and more diversity in terms of what people could eat. We have fewer nomadic peoples, meaning people were not having to move around for food anymore. They could stay in one settled place. So you have more of a sedentary existence than ever before, and more people not having to do agriculture and being able to do other things in society in their new, more stable homes. And so you have the development of people going into different businesses in those societies, like jewelry and pottery making and woodworking and so on. And this leads to more and more people congregating in the most advantageous locations, and you have the development of cities. You also have more machines coming down the pike, like John Deere's steel plow. And that's a picture of the steel plow right there, being able to cut through cold earth better than ever before. And you have commercial agriculture happening at scale, meaning all of a sudden we're really going to a larger scale in terms of what people could produce to sell to other people. When we talk about this era, we also have to make sure we're not forgetting the Columbian Exchange. And I know you read about that and I had you do a question on it, but it is emphasized by the College Board as something that you really should be familiar with. So I just want to play this short video because I think the narrator does a wonderful job of underscoring some important points.
Although we tend to think about Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492 transforming the history of the Americas, it actually transformed a great deal more than that. And in this video, I want to talk about the larger world historical process that Columbus's voyage opened up that transformed not only the Americas, but also Europe and Africa. And this was called the Columbian Exchange. So what was the Columbian Exchange? This is a process of transferring plants, animals, microbes, and people across the Atlantic in both directions. And not just trading these goods, but transplanting them from Europe and Africa into the Americas and the other way around. And some of these exchanges of species were intentional, like bringing new crops to grow in environments that were suited to them. And some of them were unintentional, like the microbes and pests, which were like little hitchhikers on the bodies and crops that Europeans brought to the New World. And it had a tremendous environmental effect that had real consequences for people on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's look a little bit closer at some of the things that were exchanged across the Atlantic after Columbus began the process of bringing things from the Old World to the New World and from the New World to the Old World. So first, let's take a closer look at the plants. Now, Spain, much like Portugal, was hoping to use this tropical landscape to grow cash crops. And so Columbus brought with him sugar and grapes for wine and coffee. These were all crops that would fetch high prices in Europe. It was so lucrative to grow sugar in the Caribbean that they didn't even want to give up any space to grow food. They imported their food so that they could spend all of their land growing sugar. The Europeans also brought New World crops back to the Old World. And some of these, it's almost impossible to imagine a world before, for example, the tomato had ever come to Europe. Can you imagine Italian food with no tomato sauce? They also brought corn and potatoes and sweet potatoes and cassava or manioc. And what's important about most of these crops is that they're very calorically dense. So if you grew a field of potatoes instead of a field of wheat, which might be a typical crop grown in the old world before contact, you can feed 3 times as many people with a field of potatoes than you can with wheat. So what does this cause? It causes a real increase in population in Europe. It also causes an increase in population in Africa, where manioc is a crop that was frequently grown and also very calorically dense. So New World foods helped Europe and Africa increase their populations. So what about these animals? The Europeans brought cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses to the New World with mixed results. Horses, for example, were a tremendous technology that was widely adopted throughout Mexico, and the Native Americans living in the Great Plains of what is today the United States found that horses revolutionized their ability to hunt. So that was a great step up for them. The pigs they brought over, however, weren't so great because Europeans allowed the pigs to roam freely, which meant that they ate everything, including the Native Americans' crops, and they multiplied very quickly. So they became kind of a pest in the New World. Probably the thing that had the biggest effect in the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of Old World diseases to the New World. So with Europeans came smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and the Native Americans had very little immunity to these diseases. It's estimated that within 100 years of Columbus landing in Hispaniola, 90% of all people who were living in the Americas died of disease. This is a demographic catastrophe, the likes of which the world has never seen before or since. And most of the Native Americans who were affected by these diseases would never have actually interacted with a European. They just had trade networks that spread these diseases back and forth throughout the Americas. Now, you might be wondering, okay, so if the Native Americans were being exposed to new diseases from the Europeans, weren't the Europeans also being exposed to new diseases from the Native Americans? Why didn't it have such a strong impact on them? There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there was a greater population density in Europe and Africa. There were more people and they lived closer together in cities. And so this gave diseases opportunities to bounce back and forth between people and evolve and become stronger. The other important thing is that Europeans lived close to animals. And as we remember from things like bird flu or swine flu, animals and humans can pass diseases back and forth between each other, and that makes those diseases even stronger. In comparison, Native Americans didn't have much population density, and they only domesticated dogs. And dogs, unlike pigs, can't pass that many diseases back and forth between humans. So Native Americans just didn't have diseases that were as vicious as the diseases that had been passed from person to person for many thousands of years in Europe and Africa. So this gets to the last aspect of the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of people. So very quickly after Europeans arrived, The Native American population suffered from a tremendous outbreak of disease, which meant that although the Europeans had hoped to enslave them and use them as a labor force in these Caribbean plantations, very few of them survived, which meant that the Europeans needed another labor force. They found that labor source on the west coast of Africa, where there was a long tradition of slave trading. And they brought enslaved African people against their will across the Atlantic to work in the Caribbean. So that very quickly, a majority of the population in the Caribbean was of African descent. Ironically, this population explosion brought on by New World foods meant that there were more people in Africa who were possible subjects to enslavement, and it helped them keep their population numbers relatively steady despite the exodus of as many as 12 to 13 million people over the course of the years between Columbus arriving and approximately 1800. Likewise, this population explosion in Europe led to worries about overpopulation in the 1600s and 1700s. And what did the nations of Europe do? They began sending people over to the colonies. So the contact and exchange initiated by Christopher Columbus when he connected the old world with the new had a profound effect on the environment, not just of the new world, but of the old world as well. And this profound effect on the whole benefited Europe at the expense of the Americas and of Africa.
So there we see plants and animals obviously being part of what we're looking at with agriculture, and you see how that fits into the larger context of the Columbian exchange and the further contextualization with people and microbes and diseases and so forth, and how that all fits into one larger picture.
Although we tend to think about
Third agricultural revolution, the tar. So when we think about the third agricultural revolution, we're really getting into modern history. We're talking about more advanced mechanical devices being used, improved techniques in farming, including farming that is aided by electricity. So we start to get things resembling things that we use today, like tractors and combines and fertilizers that aren't based only on natural substances. We have synthetic fertilizers and pesticides to help cut down on waste in terms of crop yield. And we start to see the first gene manipulation of crops that allows for higher yield crops, meaning you get more bang for your buck in terms of what you plant, you get more harvest. So this is called the Green Revolution. Green Revolution. And I'm going to be getting into that as well. This is on selective breeding.
Selective breeding is also known as artificial selection. It is a process by which humans breed plants and animals for particular genetic characteristics. We have been doing this for thousands of years, ever since we first bred food crops from wild plants and started domesticating animals about 10,000 years ago. This is when we made the transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers. We no longer needed to wander around to gather food supplies. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas, rice, and potatoes were all cultivated by early citizens. We also began to tame animals for milk, meat, and hides. Goats, sheep, and chickens are thought to have been the first animals to be domesticated, followed later by bigger animals like horses and oxen for plowing and transportation. Agriculture allowed fewer people to provide more food. Regular, predictable food production led to increased populations and density of people. People now had the time to travel, trade, and communicate. Settlements began growing. The first villages and then cities were built near fields of domesticated plants. Civilization was founded upon selective breeding. How does selective breeding work? Parents with the desired characteristics are selected from a mixed population and are bred together. From the offspring, those with the desired characteristics are then also bred together. This continues over many generations until all the offspring show the desired characteristic. Just think of all the breeds of dog that are around today. These were all selectively bred from a common wolf ancestor. The desired characteristics that we select for can be chosen for usefulness or appearance, such as insect and disease resistance in food crops by breeding from the naturally resistant individuals to increase yields. Animals which produce more meat or milk to increase yields. Domestic dogs with a gentle nature. Large or unusual flowers. We just keep breeding and selecting, and breeding once more, until we hit the desired jackpot. Look at what we've done to modern chickens in 50 years. It's over 4 times bigger due to selective breeding.
So that selective breeding has been going on a very long time, but combined with gene manipulation and advanced scientific knowledge in the third agricultural revolution, we start to reach a different level of efficiency with all that. So the Green Revolution, this was in the 1940s. And we're talking about using gene manipulation in combination with modern machinery of the time, modern fertilizers, and state of the art approaches to farming. And this is all really good stuff, right? That has helped feed people worldwide. And it's taking that knowledge and exporting it to places where people don't have food. And it's meant with, for the most part, with really good intentions, from core countries to peripheral countries, notably in Asia, Africa, and South America. And so you get more food at higher yields, often more than once per season. So you're not just getting one crop and that's it. You're able to plant more in the cycles, and you're using fewer humans in your farming endeavors. This is at lower costs. You're using less land in these areas. No more fallow fields. You can keep planting and planting and planting because you're using those modern fertilizers. This allows for more predictability and reliability of the crops, and really gets to the point of all this, which is reducing poverty and hunger in these areas that were struggling. This also allows people to branch out into other things and stop devoting all their efforts to just subsistence farming and developing more balanced, diverse economies, better economics, more jobs in things like manufacturing. But after about 20 years into this, it became clear that there were drawbacks to the Green Revolution efforts. So the new crops required fertilizer, and these fertilizers weren't the natural, like dung-based fertilizers. These were chemical fertilizers that could cause long-term harm to the environment. There was also a tremendous startup cost and an adaptation cost and keeping up with modern technology cost to switching to the methods involved with the Green Revolution. It ended up with a waste of food, not all of it getting processed. And so a lot higher percentage of the crop was being wasted than ever before. And then over time, you start to get resistance to the herbicides and pesticides that were being used. So at first, they were really, really effective. But after that, they were not. And the bugs started getting to the leaves and so forth. Economically, you have people not growing a variety of things so much. They start monocropping and doing farming towards the things that will sell, and that's called cash cropping, right? The things that they can export. And the techniques that people were using in the Green Revolution with all this mechanization ended up eroding the soil quite a bit and having loss of natural nutrients within the soil and relying heavily on those fertilizers more and more. And the bottom line is that even after all these advents of the Green Revolution, even all the benefits that it brought, there was still and remains still significant hunger in these areas. So there we go. We have the agricultural revolution trilogy with the first, second, and third. Oh, but boom, the fourth agricultural revolution, right? And so this is just